The morning they left for the mission, the air smelled like diesel fuel and wet dirt. It always smelled that way in that part of the country, a specific combination of the old and the functional, the land and the machine, that stayed in your memory long after everything else about a place had faded. Sergeant First Class Maya Reeves had been smelling it for 7 months. She had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing things that are always present. She noticed it that morning because something else was different, and the familiar smell made the difference stand out in a way she could not immediately name. She chalked it up to nerves. The mission was a longer one than most, a 3-day patrol through a valley system that the intelligence had flagged as a likely transit route for a weapons network that had been disrupting operations in the area for 6 weeks. She had been on longer patrols. She had been in harder terrain. But something about the morning had the quality of a day that was going to be significant. And she had learned over to deployments to pay attention to that quality without letting it become fear. Maya Reeves was 31 years old and had been in the Army for 10 years. She had grown up in a small city in Mississippi, the second of 4 children in a household where money was consistently scarce and consistency itself was something of a luxury. She had joined the Army at 21 not because she had always dreamed of it, but because she was practical and because the Army offered specific and concrete things: stability, training, a path forward that she could see clearly from where she was standing. What she had not expected was that she would be good at it in a way that was more than competence, that the work would fit her mind and her body and her particular way of approaching problems in a way that made her, by the time she was 31, one of the most effective small unit leaders in her battalion. Her team that morning was 8 people. She knew all of them well, some of them very well. Her squad had been together for 5 months of the deployment, which was long enough that the individual quirks and capabilities and limitations of each person had become as familiar as furniture. Specialist Okonkwo, who was the best shot in the squad and who hummed old church hymns under his breath when he was nervous. Corporal Davies, who talked constantly during downtime and went completely silent when things got serious, which was actually how she preferred it. Private First Class Hernandez, the youngest, who had been in country for 4 months and was still in the process of becoming the soldier he was going to be. And the others: A. Miller, Cho, Vasquez, Pratty, each of them a person she knew and trusted in the specific way you know and trust the people whose lives depend on your decisions and whose decisions your life depends on. The patrol left the forward operating base at 0600. The plan was simple in the way that plans are always simple before the terrain and the enemy and the 100 uncontrollable variables of real operations begin to complicate them. They would move northeast through the valley system, establish observation posts at 3 designated points, collect intelligence on movement patterns, and return to base by the 3rd day. Standard work. Work they had done versions of many times. The first day went without incident. They moved through the lower valley, crossed a series of dry stream beds that would have been dangerous to cross in the rainy season but were now just rock and sand, and established their first observation post on a ridge that gave them a long view down the valley they had come up. The intelligence picture was consistent with what they had been briefed: movement in the valley, mostly foot traffic, patterns that suggested the transit network was active. They documented what they saw and moved on. The second day was when it started to go wrong, though it did not go wrong all at once. It went wrong in the gradual way that situations in complex terrain often go wrong. A small deviation from the planned route to avoid an area that looked compromised, which led to a slightly different approach to the second observation post, which put them on a path that was less familiar and that the maps were less accurate about. None of these individual steps was a serious error. Taken together, they moved the squad out of the terrain they had studied and into terrain they were navigating in real time, which was a different and more demanding thing. Maya was aware of the drift. She had been tracking their position carefully, cross-referencing the GPS with the terrain features and the map, noting the growing gap between where the plan said they should be and where they actually were. She made to route adjustments to try to close the gap. And the second of those adjustments, taken late in the afternoon of the second day, put them on a hillside that funneled them into a narrow draw feature that was not well represented on the maps because it was a small feature, and small features were often imprecise on maps made from aerial imagery. The draw was an ambush site. She knew it the moment she entered it, knew it in the way that soldiers who have been in the field long enough develop a sense for, a sudden clarity about the geometry of the space that told her the angles were wrong. that the walls on either side were too close and too steep, that the draw narrowed in front of them in a way that left no good options for movement. She called a halt. She was preparing to call a withdrawal back the way they had come. The first shots came from the ridge line to the left. The first few seconds of an ambush have a quality that is almost impossible to describe to someone who has not been in one. The compression and acceleration of time that happens simultaneously, so that everything seems to be happening very fast, and yet each individual moment registers with extraordinary clarity. Maya was moving before she was fully conscious of deciding to move, going left toward the nearest cover, which was a shallow depression in the hillside that was not enough cover, but was better than standing in the open. She heard Davies go down. She heard Okonkwo returning fire from somewhere to her right. She heard the radio crackling as Hernandez called it in, the words coming fast and precise despite the chaos, which told her he was further along in the process of becoming a soldier than she had thought. She was firing. She was moving. She was trying to understand the geometry of the ambush, where the shooters were, how many positions. Whether the fire was coming from one side or two. It was coming from two sides. The next 30 seconds were the worst. The squad was caught in a cross angle, and the cover was insufficient, and they were taking casualties. She could see Miller down and not moving. She could see Vasquez moving but moving wrong, which meant he was hit and still trying to function, which was both admirable and worrying. She was making decisions in fractions of seconds, calling movement, calling fire, trying to manage the tactical situation, while the tactical situation was actively trying to kill everyone in the squad. She took the hit when she was crossing a piece of open ground between two positions. She felt it before she understood it, a sudden violent impact in her left side that spun her and knocked her down and left her for a moment unable to process what had happened. She had been hit before, a minor wound in her second deployment that had required stitches and a week of light duty. This was not that. This was different. This was a different order of magnitude. She was on the ground, and the ground was very hard, and the shooting was still happening around her. She tried to get up. Her body was not fully cooperating. She managed to get to her hands and knees, and then to a position behind a rock that was slightly better than lying in the open. She was bleeding. She could feel the bleeding. She got her hand to the wound and pressed and assessed the damage as best she could. And the assessment was that it was serious, and that she needed to keep pressure on it, and needed to keep moving, and needed to do both of those things simultaneously, which was difficult. The ambush broke over the next for minutes. The squad returned enough fire to suppress the shooters long enough to move, and the remaining members of the team pulled back through the draw and up the hillside and away from the kill zone. Maya was moving with them, or she thought she was moving with them. She was having difficulty with time and with her sense of where her body was in space, which she recognized as symptoms of blood loss and shock, and which she was trying to counteract with the mental discipline she had spent years developing. The ability to stay present and functional when her body was reporting conditions that argued strongly against presence and function. Somewhere in the movement out of the draw, she became separated. She did not know exactly when it happened. One moment she was behind Cho, moving uphill, and then she was not behind Cho, and she was moving in a direction that may or may not have been the same direction the rest of the squad was moving. The hillside was steep and rocky, and the light was failing as the sun went down, and she was not at full capacity for navigation or for anything else. The first hour of movement was the worst. Her body was still in the shock phase, the phase where the wound was real, but the full weight of it had not yet settled into her nervous system, where the adrenaline from the ambush was still doing some of the work that her strength would eventually have to do alone. She moved fast in that first hour, faster than was probably wise, because the draw where the ambush had happened was not far below her, and she needed distance from it before the adrenaline ran out. And before any enemy search began, she moved southwest, by the stars and the GPS, keeping the brightest star over her left shoulder and adjusting when the terrain forced her off the straight line. The hillside she had descended from the ridge was rocky and loose in places, the kind of slope that needed both hands and both feet at certain points. And at those points she released the pressure on the wound and moved quickly, and then stopped and pressed hard again when she reached a flat place. The bleeding was not good. She had packed the wound as tightly as she could with the materials in her kit. But movement reopened it, and there was a limit to how long she could keep operating on the supply she had. She thought about Supplies the way she always thought about resources. In the field, as a calculation rather than a fear. She had 3 field dressings, 2 of which she had already used. She had the material from her undershirt, which she could cut and use as additional pressure bandage. She had water for approximately 36 hours if she rationed it, which was not enough for the full distance she needed to cover, but was enough to work with for now. She had 6 protein bars that she did not want to eat because eating would draw blood to her stomach and away from her extremities, which in her current state was a bad trade-off. She would eat when she stopped for rest, not while moving. She set her first rest point in her mind as a low ridge she could see in the darkness about 3 kilometers southwest of her current position. 3 kilometers was not far under normal conditions. Under these conditions, wounded and moving in the dark over rough terrain, it was going to take between 90 minutes and 2 hours. She set her pace accordingly, steady, not fast. The kind of pace that could be maintained for hours rather than the kind that felt good for 20 minutes and then collapse. Moving in the dark and mountain terrain requires a specific kind of attention. You cannot see the ground well enough to trust your eyes completely. So you develop a kind of distributed awareness, feet feeling for stable placement. Body weight centered and ready to adjust, hands available for balance. Eyes reading the terrain in the shapes and shadows that darkness allows. Maya had developed this awareness over months in these mountains, and it was available to her now even in her reduced state. A kind of automatic competence that continued, operating when conscious thought was being used for other things. The other things her conscious thought was being used for were the questions she was not going to allow herself to get lost in, but that were nevertheless present and needed to be managed. Where was the rest of her squad? Were they alive? Had they called in the ambush? Were people looking for her? Was anyone going to find her before she found them? She managed these questions by naming them and then setting them aside, not because they were not important, but because they were not actionable. She could not answer them. What she could do was move, and so she moved. There was one question she did allow herself to hold. It was the question of whether the squad had made it out and assumed she was dead. If they had made it out and assumed she was dead, which was a reasonable assumption given that she had been badly wounded and separated in a firefight and had not reappeared, then the search and rescue response would be shaped by that assumption. They might send people to recover her body rather than extract a survivor. They might, in the math of combat where resources are finite and risk must be calibrated against likelihood, choose not to send anyone at all. She was not angry about this possibility. She had thought about it for approximately 4 minutes and had then put it in the category of things she could not control and therefore would not spend energy on. If they came looking for her, she would be easy to find because she would be moving toward the base. If they did not come looking for her, she would walk to the base herself. Either way, the action required of her was the same. She reached the low ridge in 1 hour and 40 minutes, which was slightly faster than her conservative estimate, and told her that her body was performing better than the wound suggested it should. She found a sheltered spot on the far side of the ridge, out of the line of sight from the valley below and from the direction she had come from. And she sat down and allowed herself 5 minutes of stillness. The stillness was functional, not rest. She checked the wound, replacing the outer dressing and pressing fresh material against the deepest point of the injury where the bleeding was most persistent. She drank 3 careful mouthfuls of water. She updated her GPS position and calculated the remaining distance to the base, 19 kilometers, which in these terrain conditions was going to require 2 more full days of movement minimum, possibly 3 given her condition. She looked at the stars to confirm her bearing. She also listened. The mountains at night had a specific sound profile: wind, insects, the occasional distant animal, and any deviation from that profile meant something. She listened